Good morning, Liberty. It is Monday morning, January 14th, 2019. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting to you live through the 10th Amendment Center YouTube channel here on the West Coast at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from my home office and studio here in downtown Los Angeles. So good morning to you, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be tuning in, whether it's here live with me on YouTube or it's in the archive through any of our many other channels like BitChute, BitTube, Keyport.tv, or our podcasts at iTunes, Spotify. I got to think about these, and Google. So I appreciate everyone joining me today. I hope you had a great weekend. I did a lot of relaxing over the weekend and some errands and things, so it was nice to catch up on some of the day-to-day. But we're back to the nitty-gritty today, and this is the time of year, if you've been paying attention to this show regularly, that we call nullification season. So I've done a couple of episodes that highlighted efforts in states where bills have been filed to undermine various government or centralized or federal programs. For example, there's an episode from last week on a number of states taking action or with bills to take on asset forfeiture and to hopefully bring it down, explaining both the state, civil and criminal, and then the federal equitable sharing program. And another episode where I talked about constitutional carry, and I don't know if I did a good enough job, and I want to develop kind of the talking points, the understanding about this. In that constitutional carry, for example, basically I think it's better called permitless carry. I think it really is an important part of, even though it doesn't directly take on any federal gun control, we're talking about removing restrictions on having the ability to open or conceal carry on a state level. But I think just by doing this, when you create an environment that's friendly to the right to keep and bear arms, it becomes much more difficult for the federal government to actually enact even their own gun control sometime in the future. Because if no one is using an item, let's say they want to ban cell phones, and if no one had cell phones, it would be pretty easy because only those weirdos or those nutcases. But if it's ubiquitous, it's part of society, it becomes much easier to develop resistance to their plans in the future. That's why when we're talking about undermining federal power, we're not just talking about responding to federal actions all the time, but we're also talking about trying to advance liberty where we can, which is on a state or a local or an individual level, because the more that we exercise our rights, the more difficult it's going to be when they approach us to take those from us or attack them. I think that's a big part of it. But today I want to talk about some strategies that can be used on a state level outside of those on constitutional carry, for example. But three main strategies that are based off of advice from the founders. I'm not necessarily going to go into that particular advice on this show, but three main types of strategies, similar ideas, but applied differently. And they kind of go like this. The first one is to legalize what the federal government prohibits. We know that happened with weed, for example, and I'll get into more detail. Banning resources on the enforcement of something that the federal government, so not participating or helping the federal government. That's what states or local communities. I think it's important to include local on all of this as well. And then just to simply opt out of federal programs, because many federal programs are simply a federal plan or a national plan that has just been implemented completely by the states. So if you opt out, then it doesn't exist. So I want to go into that and then also talk about some bills that are being filed that fit each of those strategies pretty well. I think there might be one or two that actually fit both or multiple strategies at the same time. But before doing that, of course, I want to say hi to everyone out in the live chat. Joseph Standridge, Justin Bayola, Scouse Jack, Existence, and good afternoon to George McClelland out in Florida. I really appreciate you guys being here, and everyone else who is not necessarily leaving comments. I really appreciate you spending time with me. Very important reminder, of course, smash the like button, whether you are watching live on mobile, on a desktop, or you're watching in the archive. It's on YouTube. It doesn't matter where you're tuning in. Make sure you hit the like button because that helps us spread the word. It's a very cheap and easy way to pitch in and get the message out because it triggers any algorithms that any platforms may have and encourages that platform to show this video to other people. Hi to Ward Lawrence as well. Good morning, Liberty lovers. I appreciate you guys being here with me today. So let's get into this. Before getting into each of the strategies, Oh, and awesome, George McClellan. I appreciate the tip, the $5 tip. That is awesome. Really appreciate that. Existence, crush the like button, guys. This is really a grassroots effort. So when we all pitch in, whether it's just tapping a like button, sharing, or pitching in a few dollars, this really helps us get the word out and continue doing what we're doing here on a day-to-day basis. So thank you to George and everyone else here today. I appreciate it a lot. So going forward, let's talk about strategy. I think it's important not only to talk philosophically about what we want to accomplish, which is, of course, the Constitution and more liberty. We're trying to attain liberty. The reason the Constitution even existed, the idea was to create an environment where attacks on liberty would be more difficult to pull off because it isn't one central control over everything. So not only do we want to talk about the philosophy, which we do a lot throughout the year, but this time of year being nullification season, let's talk about how to put it into practice. What can we do to undermine attacks on our liberty, which come across the political spectrum and on all kinds of issues? And to start out, I want to start out with this letter that Thomas Jefferson sent to James Madison just after the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 passed from November 10th. I think it was signed by the governor on the 16th. So on the 17th, he sent a letter of a draft of them to James Madison. And he just mentioned, and I've talked about it on this show, and we've covered it in videos, it's really important to understand strategy. What did Jefferson think when he was talking about nullifying the Alien and Sedition Acts? That a nullification is the rightful remedy, which was in his original draft, to all assumptions of power outside the constitutional limits. What has been delegated to the federal government? What did Jefferson say? He said, I enclose you. So it's just a short letter to JM, which is pretty cool. J to JM, Monticello, November 17, 1798. And he says, I enclose you a copy of the draft of the Kentucky Resolves. I think we should distinctly affirm all the important principles that they contain so as to hold to that ground in the future and leave the matter in such a train as that we may not be committed absolutely to push the matter to extremities, and yet may be free to push as far as events will render prudent. That, to me, is the greatest strategy advice on advancing liberty ever, personally. It is a reminder that you never abandon your ultimate principles. You always espouse them every chance you get. You talk about all the important principles, but you recognize that you can't always get from crap tyranny today to ultimate principles in one step. You don't always push to the extremities because you have to win over the general public. So sometimes it just takes talking about them. Sometimes it takes implementing them in small steps. Sometimes it takes a combination. Sometimes you need bigger steps to get the small steps. Sometimes you start with a big step attempt, recognizing that you're willing to take a smaller step, but you're always moving the ball forward. And he was very clear about this, even in dealing with something, the Alien and Sedition Acts, that he thought was one of the most dangerous threats in the early days of the Republic, if not the worst. So he says, we want to always espouse our ultimate principles, but we recognize that strategy doesn't always allow that to happen, and we want to push as far as we can. Now, if we don't push enough, then we're not going to get anything done. If we push too much, we're not going to get anything done. So it's a lot of give and take. It's not necessarily you want to give up things, but you have to recognize that we're going against the most powerful government on the face of the earth in the history of the world. And they're very resistant to anything positive for freedom. So let's get through these three strategies that I see that kind of put this principle into practice. And then also there's a lot of videos that we've done about Madison's advice in Federalist 46, where he recommended that individuals and states utilize a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And the first type of strategy is to legalize what the federal government prohibits. Now, we know that there are now 33 states that have refused to be a part of the federal. Well, they aren't really refusing. I'm actually getting ahead of myself a little bit. That in many ways are enabling people to refuse make it easier for people to refuse the federal prohibition scheme on a plant called marijuana, the cannabis plant. There are 33 states. When we first started seeing this happen in the mid-90s here in California, I wasn't an activist at the time. I was a statist, socialist, communist. I would identify myself as a communist pig who I was anti-war and I was anti-oppression in many ways, but my economic idiocy probably helped me advocate for things that were oppression. So just a really confused viewpoint that I had at the time. But I remember when California, and I had just moved here from Wisconsin a year before that in 1995, I was in college. And I remember when this thing passed and a friend had reached out to me and said, hey, Boldin, you want to meet up? We're going to go to a weed store. This was sometime in early 97. And I thought this was the strangest thing. Oh, they can't do this. They're not allowed. Now, mind you, in the run-up to the vote in fall of 96, 3 presidents, one current one at the time and 2 previous, came to California to tell us if you voted on this, you would be wasting your time, your money, and energy in an unwinnable lawsuit because the supremacy clause says federal law is always supreme. Now, that, of course, is a lie. We know how the people responded to that. We know now that 33 states are defying Washington, D.C. on this, even though the federal government has increasingly tried to ramp up enforcement. It did over a period of four terms in office over 3 presidents. And since then, it's really fallen off because the states kept doing things that the federal government prohibited. And sooner or later, it falls apart. A few years ago, I did a video where I said specifically, sooner or later, the federal government is going to back off on this prohibition thing because they've lost, but they have to pretend they're going to have to act like they're the ones that are allowing people to live free or more freely in this regard just to save face, because otherwise they're going to look bad. And eventually people are going to catch on that if you have 30 states doing something that the feds say you can't, there's no way for the federal government to stop them. But it isn't just weed. I've talked about this for many years. Why not take this weed strategy and apply it to other things? I often talk about the right to keep and bear arms on various issues. But another one that I think we can consider is raw milk. So you can be a fan of raw milk or hate it. I actually consume it from time to time. It's fully legal here in California. You don't have to, like in many states, you don't have to own part of a cow or have to buy it on a farm to be able to purchase it. I walk down to the corner market down the street. It's a local independent market, and I can buy it right here. I can buy from local grocery chain markets. I can't buy from a place like Amazon Whole Foods because they're concerned about interstate commerce. So everything they do affects, in quotes, interstate commerce. So therefore, they're concerned about the federal government on this. Now, the federal government not only, and I'm looking at this report, of course, all the show notes and the links are, of course, on YouTube here, but also we post all of our archives and show links over at 10thAmendmentCenter.com/goodmorningliberty. So the federal government claims the power to ban the interstate commerce and sale of raw milk. So they say that if you buy something in Texas, you can't, or you produce something in Texas, you can't sell it in Oklahoma. You got to keep it in the state. But a few years ago, and this is what Tamara Ward from the FDA said, it's the FDA's position that raw milk should never be consumed. Never. So, but they also want it to be illegal. So it's not just their opinion, and they have a federal law providing that, quote, no person shall cause to be delivered in interstate commerce anything that's raw milk. This is on the books. So the feds take the position that interstate commerce of milk that has not been pasteurized is illegal. But on top of that, they hold the view that they have the power. The FDA holds the power to ban intrastate. If something is bought and sold here in California or bought and sold in Texas or wherever, they claim the power under the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause, to ban the sale of that product within state borders. And they said specifically, it is within HHS's authority to institute an intrastate ban on unpasteurized milk as well. So the feds want to end this. They haven't taken action to do that. But at some point, they certainly could, or they might try to do it. I believe that they want to. They always increase their power at the extent of liberty, at the expense of liberty. And so I expect it to happen at some point in the future if no one is buying and selling raw milk. So I try to participate as much as I can by making purchases from time to time. You may disagree with my health choice on that, but that is really, it's up to me and it's up to you on whether or not. It shouldn't be up to Washington, D.C. on whether or not we can purchase a dairy product, which is absolutely absurd. So a bill like this one in Texas, House Bill 503 from Representative Dan Flynn, actually expands the market for raw milk sales in the state. And so the more that the states get out of the way of prohibition on this, the harder it's going to be for the federal government to do this. And Mike Meharry, in his report on this Texas bill, the FDA, he says, the FDA clearly wants a complete prohibition of raw milk, and some insiders say it's only a matter of time before the feds try to institute an absolute ban. But when states allow the sale of raw milk within their borders, like here in California, it takes an important step towards nullifying this federal prohibition scheme. As we've seen with marijuana and industrial hemp, an intrastate ban becomes ineffective when states ignore it and pass laws encouraging the prohibited activity anyways. The federal government lacks the enforcement power necessary to maintain its ban, and people will willingly take on the small risk of federal sanctions if they know the state will not interfere. This is how we've seen it interfere. Well, we've seen this play out on weed already. It's possible we're already seeing it play out in some ways on raw milk, because there are many states that are allowing at least a limited sales of raw milk. Not a lot like Pennsylvania, and maybe not even Pennsylvania, but here in California, which is just open season. You don't need a special ownership herd share agreement or anything like that. You just go to the store and you buy your product, and you take your own risk. I mean, we're talking about personal responsibility. That's part of liberty. So for me, the pasteurized milk is my risk. I get ill every time I have it, but I don't want to have raw milk or raw kefir. So we all have our own physiology, I guess. So the idea is the more that people do this, if all 50 states legalize this, then an interstate and intrastate ban from Washington, D.C. is almost pointless, because the localities aren't enforcing the ban. The feds don't have the resources to enforce the ban, and therefore the market continues to grow if there's market demand. I think the message is straightforward. We're talking about human action and markets being stronger than government. Now, when states get out of the way, one layer of government gets out of the way, it becomes harder for the far-off government to do the same. But it's not just raw milk. Another bill that I want to talk about that I thought was really interesting, and this is basically taking on something, and I don't think Representative Hicks in Missouri got this from me, but I used to almost, well, it was definitely serious, but in a way jokingly suggest to people, well, the people who need firearms the most are the ones who have the least physical capability. People who are ill, who are elderly, someone who can be easily overpowered by an assailant. Those are the people that everybody needs to be able to defend themselves. But you'd think in the psyche of the general public, this is how medical marijuana started, and now it's becoming legalized all over the country, Canada as well. Because at first, the opposition was reduced because people would say, look, this person is ill and their doctor says they need this. Don't block them from having it. And that brought on a lot of people who maybe weren't advocates for something to at least drop opposition. And that built over time. So I would often say, well, why are there gun restrictions for, why isn't there a medical short-barreled shotgun for someone in, for example, a wheelchair? Like the National Firearms Act makes it, I don't know, someone who understands gun laws better than I do, I don't know if it's fully illegal or if it's mostly illegal or if you have to get special permission to get one, but it's probably not easy to get a short-barreled shotgun under the National Firearms Act of 1934. Maybe it's impossible, but why not have a medical one for people who have a broken leg or something, who can't carry around a giant firearm, that wanted to be able to defend themselves and get out into the general public? I mean, you can have a motorized, self-powered wheelchair. Why not arm it? I mean, this may sound silly to some people, but I think there's some logic to it. Scouse Jack says in the live chat, handguns are feminist. Absolutely. Absolutely. What way to fight off the male pigs than to point a laser sight at someone who's being aggressive? So House Bill 302 from Representative Ron Hicks in Missouri basically creates a scenario where could be medical firearms silencers, or really more rightly called suppressors. We put silencers in quotes, even though it says that in the bill. I believe the right term is suppressor. But basically, here's what it says. Representative Ron Hicks filed House Bill 302 on December 18th. Under the proposed law, persons with significant hearing loss could legally possess a firearm sound suppressor, commonly referred to as a silencer. Any person with a written certificate from a licensed medical doctor, otologist, or neurotologist, I don't know those terms, attesting that the person has significant hearing loss and that a firearm silencer would be beneficial to preserve the person's remaining hearing could legally possess a firearm sound suppressor under state law. Currently, and this is the important part, Missouri enforces federal regulations on firearm sound suppressors by making their possession in violation of federal law a state crime. So there's this federal law or regulation on suppressors. And this creative state representative is saying, well, what about, let's at least start here. I'm not sure if his goal is to say, well, let's do away with any state law restricting this. If he is, fine. If not, fine. I definitely want to point out that there should be no restriction on this on a federal or a state level. We know that the federal government isn't going to change this, but if some people in Missouri recognize that, okay, at least for now, let's try it out and let the people who, like, if they're going to use a firearm in gun country Missouri, and they're on the verge, they can't use it anymore because they've got such hearing loss. And the only way they can continue to do this is if they use a suppressor that we would normally say is illegal. Let's get that out of the way. The doctor says they need this. It's helping them. And I think this is actually an incredibly positive strategy. Some people may laugh at it, and I saw some comments when we posted on Facebook calling this absurd. Everybody needs this, or no one needs it. If they can't hear well, then they made a bad choice. I mean, I don't care. If someone wants to use something and their doctor says, here's the best way to use it, it shouldn't be up to me to say they can't. And it shouldn't be up to me and you or anyone else through government to prevent them, to create a roadblock. So I think this is a really positive strategy. It's a strategy we know absolutely has worked on marijuana and even on industrial hemp. And it'd be great to see this applied to all levels of firearms. Find all kinds of things in Washington, D.C. that are illegal and come up with a medical reason. I mean, there are so many, like life. But we can take that to the logical conclusion, of course. So I think that's a very positive approach. I'd like to see House Bill 302. I know Mr. Sanderson, I think it's Rob, who comes by and watches pretty often. He said he had been making some calls and sent some emails in support of that. So if you're in Missouri, you definitely want to call your state rep and ask them to co-sponsor House Bill 302. ASDF QWERTY 2000 firearms for the disabled is hilarious but genius. I mean, I think so too. There is something, I think people chuckle at it. It's like, oh, it sounds so absurd. But of course, who needs to be protected more than the people who have the least physical capability? And why not at least start there? And then once people learn that the world doesn't come to an end because people who need help of a tool, whether it's a plant or a firearm or a suppressor or whatever it may be, when people learn that the world doesn't come to an end, but it actually helps people, then there's less opposition. And over time, you can expand it to more people. To me, I think it should be expanded to everyone. But this is an excellent strategic first step. According to Thomas Jefferson, push as far as events will render prudent. I'm not sure if events render something further than this prudent in Missouri. That's not up to me. So the second strategy that I want to get into, that's the first strategy. Legalize what the feds prohibit. We know it's worked on weed. It's working on raw milk. And we'd like to see it work even further on firearms and accessories. Now, the next step is to ban resources for the enforcement of something. And no one, and I've talked about this on this show pretty often, and I've done some videos, and we've done some articles on this, I've done speeches. Basically, no one complains about immigration sanctuary cities because they're using language that hurts someone's feelings. Like, oh, I don't want to hear what you have to say. No one's being snowflakey about it and complaining that it's hurting their ears to read immigration sanctuary ordinances at all. That's not why people complain. People who don't like them complain about them because they're incredibly effective at undermining federal enforcement capabilities on immigration. So what we have talked about over and over is look at what they're doing, study what they're doing, and learn that it works, and then find out how to apply that to something else. And in a majority of cases, now it's not the same in all the 300 plus immigration sanctuary cities or the sanctuary state laws like in Oregon or here in California, SB 54 from a couple of years ago. But in a majority of cases, what they're doing is literally taking a hands-off approach. Local law enforcement, for example, is not allowed to help federal agents enforce federal immigration law. Now, whether you think they should be able to do it, they shouldn't be able to do it, it's a good idea or a bad idea, that is not the point of this discussion. The point here is to learn that literally just taking a hands-off approach and refusing to enforce a federal law makes that federal law unenforceable in practice. That's exactly what James Madison said would happen back when he wrote Federalist 46. That's also what Judge Andrew Napolitano has told us when he said that a single state addressing gun laws in this way, refusing to enforce a federal gun law, would make it nearly impossible to enforce. And again, I would like it 100% impossible. I would like the federal gun law gone. But making something nearly impossible to enforce is a very positive step forward. And here in North Dakota, a new bill was just filed last week. This month. We reported on it last week. That would, what we say, set the foundation for a gun rights sanctuary state. It's House Bill 1309. And what it would do, it would, quote, bar any state agency, political subdivision, law enforcement officer, or state employee from contracting with or providing assistance to a federal agency or official in the enforcement of a federal statute, order, rule, or regulation purporting to regulate a firearm accessory, or firearm ammunition in most situations. Most situations, the caveat is if it's not illegal under state law, which they should all eliminate all of that in the first place, but if it's not illegal under state law and the feds have a federal law, we're not going to help you, period. So if the feds put in a bump stock ban, like they're doing, and the state does not have a bump stock ban, then automatically it triggers, pun intended, a ban on helping the federal government do any enforcement action on a bump stock ban. Now, we know that the ATF has between 5,000 and 6,000 employees, a third of them in administration. They don't have the resources to do enforcement on their own. And in almost every situation when they're doing enforcement action, they're partnering with state and local law enforcement agencies to do the job. And if half the team quits, then that enforcement falls to pieces in most situations. So this is a big, very positive step forward, should it pass, House Bill 1309. And I like the fact of, I like the idea of calling it a gun rights sanctuary, because the idea of immigration sanctuary cities, this is very much on the tip of everyone's tongue. People know what they're talking about. You're creating an environment where you can enforce, however it's being done for most people. They don't understand what's going on the ground. But whatever is being done in those areas is making it almost impossible for the feds to enforce immigration. So why not do the same thing for the right to keep and bear arms? Because you absolutely can do it. So House Bill 1309 in North Dakota takes a very positive step forward on this if it were to pass. Now, it has a lot of co-sponsors, including the Assistant Majority Leader in the House, Representative Scott Louser. So it would be good to see this move forward. But if you live in North Dakota, you definitely want to call your state senator and representative, because they both co-sponsor. Call your state senator and state representative. If you see them on House Bill 1309, if they tell you, hey, I'm already planning on co-sponsoring, just thank them and tell them, ask them what you can do to help get the bill passed. If they're not co-sponsoring, just ask them. Even if you think they suck, just tell them this is what you want. They want to hear this type. Well, even if they don't want to hear it, they should hear it. House Bill 1309 in North Dakota. The next bill that I want to cover is something similar in Utah. This is the bill that implemented the medical marijuana program in Utah that was passed last month in December of 2018. There's one piece of it that I thought was really interesting. A lot of people talk about how in the states where people get these medical marijuana cards, they immediately risk their right to keep and bear arms because the federal government says if you use an illegal substance, you're not allowed. A controlled substance, you're not allowed to get a firearm permit. You're not allowed to purchase a weapon. And you're supposed to fill out this form that says whether or not you use a particular substance. And if you answer incorrectly or you lie, then I think it's some kind of a felony charge. So they really threaten you a lot. And there is concern about this. But again, they don't have a lot of federal agents to do this, and they always rely on local police, the county sheriff, to do the enforcement work for them. So in House Bill 3001, which implemented the marijuana program, it specifically added provision to help, and this is in Mike Meharry's report again, help protect Utah gun owners who use medical cannabis. It prohibits expending any state or local resources, including an officer's time. No time at all is allowed to be used to, quote, enforce a law that restricts an individual's right to acquire, own, or possess a firearm based solely on the individual's possession or use of cannabis in accordance with state medical cannabis laws. So if you're following the state law on medical weed, the state says automatically no officers anywhere in the state can use even time, energy, resources, any investigation. They can't, like if someone makes a call, they send a request, they need information, you can't do any data sharing, nothing to help enforce these federal laws that attack the right to keep and bear arms. I think that's also another piece that's really very important in that same type of a strategy. And then the other one that I want to talk about, again, it's weed. In Kentucky, there's a new bill, Senate Bill 80, that would expand this type of approach that Utah is the first state in the country that did this on weed and guns. But a Kentucky bill from Republican Senator Dan Sium, he's like a 77-year-old guy, which is fascinating. He introduced Senate Bill 80, which would not only legalize marijuana for recreational purposes in Kentucky, but ban the enforcement, ban the use of resources for any level of federal prohibition on weed. And I think, at least in my reading it, that should also include the right to keep and bear arms. I'd have to look at it a little bit closer as well. But in Kentucky, that's Senate Bill 80. Now, before getting to this short last strategy approach, I want to check over into the live chat. Hi to Bob Brewer. Legislators are ignoring Article 4, Section 4. Diana, you should allow interviews through other alternative media sites like Lionel Media to find. I would love to do interviews. We do them all the time. So, well, as often as they ask, either myself, Mike Meharry, TJ Martinell, absolutely. If you've got a recommendation, feel free to email these other podcasters. Say you'd like to see someone from the 10th Amendment Center on. And then feel free to email us at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And Diana says legislators get away with it because I might be missing part of it. Thumbs up from Ward Lawrence on gun rights sanctuary in North Dakota. There's a similar bill in Texas, I know, down there in Texas. I don't have it off the top of my head. Let me see if I can pull it up. There's a similar bill that we want to see move forward in Texas from Matt Krause. Here it is. Texas bill would set the foundation for a gun rights sanctuary state. It's House Bill 238. So you guys down in Texas, definitely call your state representative and ask them to co-sponsor and support House Bill 238. It's basically the same good first step forward, not complete, but it would ban the use of resources for the enforcement of any federal law that's not already on the books in Texas. Once that's passed, then the next logical step is literally to chip away at all the state laws. Because not only do you expand the right to keep and bear arms, or you get the state out of the way of attacking it, then you create an automatic trigger again to ban the enforcement or the assistance of the federal government. So the last piece. Oh, actually, one other usage of banning resources for the enforcement of something was passed over the summer in Michigan last year. It bans material support or resources for warrantless federal surveillance programs. That was House Bill 4430. We know a similar bill is up for consideration in Missouri, and we expect to see a number of other states consider similar bills on this. We'll probably do a full show on resources for federal surveillance programs, but Michigan passed the strongest one in the country so far. The only other one that's passed so far has been in California, but it needs some follow-up. So the idea behind that is, like in Utah, for example, they need millions of gallons of water to keep the supercomputers cooled, to keep the Bluffdale NSA data center open. But if the state stops providing resources through their political subdivision of water, then they can't keep the facility open. That's part of why it's actually there, is because of access to cheap resources. So even in a state like Michigan, or in Missouri or elsewhere, it's important to do this, even if there isn't a facility already open, because it says the door is not open for you to do this here in our state. And we want to box them in and then take further steps to shut down the existing ones as long as they continue violating the Constitution, which is, by their existence, absolutely happening. So the third and final way to deal with this, to deal with federal programs by using Madison and Jefferson's strategy, for example, is simply opting out of a federal program. Now, I just did a show last week on a number of states opting out of the federal equitable sharing program, noting that the first states that did it, Albuquerque, in New Mexico, and then here in California, they set a threshold of any forfeiture of $50,000 or less. They absolutely could not participate in the federal equitable sharing program. That's the process by which they do an end run around state restrictions on asset forfeiture. They just claim it's a federal law, and then the feds take all the forfeiture proceeds and give 80% back to the local government. So as long as you opt out of that program, it just doesn't exist. So it started at a $50,000 level, and then now we see a bill in Missouri, House Bill 444, that set the level to $100,000. And then today, I've got a report from just last Friday. I'd mentioned it in that show, a new bill from North Dakota that deals with the federal equitable sharing loophole by completely closing it. There's no monetary restriction. They just say it doesn't matter what amount. You cannot, if this bill passes, House Bill 1286, if this bill passes, the state is just not going to participate in this federal equitable sharing program. It's just not going to happen as a way to get around the state restrictions on civil asset forfeiture. It says, quote, a law enforcement agency may not refer or initiate a transfer of property seized under state law to a federal agency by way of adoption or equitable sharing of seized property for the purpose of property's forfeiture under federal law. So the state can't say, a law enforcement agent can't say, oh, wow, I can't forfeit this car under state law. I'm just going to call the Department of Justice and we're going to make this a federal crime, because a lot of times the crimes are doubly listed on a state and a federal level, and then they get to do the forfeiture anyway. So this bill would totally shut that down, and it's got a really good coalition of people supporting it, 12 co-sponsors, including the Senate President Pro Temp and Majority Caucus Leader David Hogue. So it's got some mainstream support, which is surprising to me, because generally mainstream support on bills means that they're pretty weak. So this is very positive. House Bill 1286 in North Dakota. And then one other bill that I want to talk about that uses the process of merely just opting out, not participating. You have your ideas, we're just not going to participate, is in New York. Senate Bill 421 from Senator Andrew Lanza would ban the use of Common Core in the state. And I know that has not been a big of a talking point for people, but these nationalized programs for education are terrible. I went to a government-run school, and I learned that government was a solution to all my problems. So, of course, the more that you centralize and nationalize it and make it a one-size-fits-all solution for the whole country, or even a whole state in many situations, if you're not addressing local needs and needs of families and individuals, then you're going to have this one-size-fits-all solution, and then it's going to be run by bureaucrats, and bureaucrats love government. So the best way to end Common Core is to stop participating in it. So Senator Andrew Lanza, kudos on him, introduced Senate Bill 421 in New York, and it's very short. Notwithstanding any provision of law to the contrary, The department shall discontinue implementation of the Common Core state standards developed by the Common Core State Standards Initiative. Any actions taken to adopt or implement the Common Core state standards are void. And you could actually look at the text of the bill here. I mean, it's basically got an introduction section, and maybe my screen is cutting it off, but it's basically 2 paragraphs. That's all you need to do. I would like to see that on the right to keep and bear arms, on Obamacare. The state shall stop implementing Obamacare. You can do that. You can do that on asset forfeiture. Very simple ones. So this one is really interesting to me. I like that it's in New York. There's a very interesting opposition opt-out campaign in New York on Common Core from both the left and the right. So this isn't necessarily a right-wing thing. There's a lot of Democrats that are on board on this. I know the Republican introduced it in the Senate, but we've seen Democrats introduce similar bills. But that would, if no one participates in Common Core, if no states participate, then Common Core doesn't exist, period. Now, I know a lot of states who tend to opt out, they basically rebrand and have the same type of thing. But that's the next step to follow up. So this is a first step forward to get out of that particular program. Then it's incumbent upon people locally to advocate for something positive there. So I hope you guys found this interesting. I am learning a ton of stuff as I go through this. And I like seeing, and it just kind of opening my eyes to seeing these different types of strategies in categories. Basically, legalize, ban enforcement, or opt out. And when you have these different strategies, then you can, and you understand that there's different categories, then you can think more creatively, like Representative Hicks in Missouri did, about like, well, if we legalize, well, I'm a right to keep and bear arms guy. What can we legalize that the feds prohibit? Clearly, suppressors for people in medical need. That is a great starting point. And thinking about strategy is really important when you're doing this. I know a lot of people just like to go like head first, ram their face into a brick wall, and then they get frustrated after one try. But this takes a lot of persistence. It takes a lot of dedication. It takes a lot of creative thinking. It takes a lot of backbone. So if you're in any of these states where I'm talking about any of this legislation, make sure to make calls, send emails in support of the bills that are important to you. And then feel free, if you've got ideas or you see other things introduced, wherever it is, feel free to send us an email over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I really appreciate all the feedback that people send to me all the time. I don't get to reply to every single one, but I appreciate every message that comes over. So I hope you found this interesting, insightful, educational, fun. Make sure to smash that like button. I really appreciate you doing that. Feel free to continue sending some comments. Whether it's here on YouTube or any of our other channels, and email me anytime. I'm looking forward to seeing you again. We're here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. I hope you have a great Monday. Thank